a bioweapons scientist found mortally wounded on a Manhattan sidewalk. His death remains steeped in mystery.
The story they gave was that he committed suicide. But is that really what happened?
Behind him, a covert career with deadly secrets.
Their interrogations were extremely brutal.
The knowledge he holds is explosive.
You have the whole weight of the CIA trying to keep it a secret.
Did the grim nature of his research push him over the edge? Or did he die because he knew too much?
Would they have killed an American citizen who was a scientist if they thought he was a security risk? There are people who say definitely.
In the early hours of November 28, 1953, while Manhattan sleeps, a scientist lies dying.
He was lying on his back on the sidewalk. He was bleeding from his ears, from his eyes, and from his nose and mouth. The night manager of the hotel ran out front.
He looked like he wanted to tell him something.
But he couldn't mouth any words.
Biochemist Dr. Frank Olson has fallen 10 floors from his room in the Hotel Statler.
The mystery was, did he commit suicide? Was he murdered? Was it an accident?
Authorities declare it an open and shut case.
The story they gave was that he committed suicide. But is that really what happened?
There are many things that we still don't know about.
His family believe the answer is no.
My husband's death was not a deliberate or a willful act. The true nature of his death was concealed from us.
For decades, family members have suspected Olson was silenced to stop him blowing the whistle on a top-secret U.S. bioweapons program. Now, investigators are taking a fresh look at the Olson mystery. Seasoned investigative journalist Hank Albarelli has studied thousands of previously secret documents relating to the case.
This is an extremely important document. It's on White House stationery.
He does not believe Frank Olson took his own life.
There's no evidence whatsoever that he ever talked about suicide, that he ever considered suicide.
Former New York City prosecutor Steve Sirocco worked 200 homicide cases in a 25-year career. He believes Olson's death is mired in a conspiracy that could go right to the top.
We're talking about the highest levels of the federal government that may be involved in killing one of their own scientists.
The possible conspiracy begins in 1950 at a top-secret U.S. Army laboratory, where Dr. Frank Olson is engaged in bacterial research.
Prior to his death, Dr. Olson was working at Fort Detrick.
That was a biochemical headquarters for the U.S. Army.
Dr. Olson's work is highly classified, but intelligence files have now been uncovered that reveal Olson was deeply involved in one of the U.S. military's darkest projects, the creation of powerful biological weapons. Germ warfare.
His work was primarily with what Camp Detrick called the Special Operations Division. And that's the most secret division at Camp Detrick.
Today, chemical and biological weapons are banned. But for 3 decades in the middle of the 20th century, the U.S. Army pours millions of dollars into their development.
The United States Biological Weapons Program, a lot of the material is still classified, but it involved understanding which biological agents would be the most lethal, which would be the most effective, how to weaponize them.
One fighter aircraft dispensing 2 wing tanks of a liquid BW agent would cause infection in more than 50% of the populace.
America's germ warfare program had been kickstarted with Nazi research. After World War II, America enlists the services of notorious Third Reich scientist Dr. Kurt Blome.
The Nazis were much further ahead than the United States in the terms of development of biological and chemical weapons.
Blome's death sentence for war crimes is commuted in exchange for his recipes on the weaponization of lethal germs, such as plague and anthrax.
And all those documents were brought back to the States and absorbed by people at Dietrich.
People, including Dr. Frank Olson. His particular area of research, the optimization of germ dispersal for biowarfare.
To weaponize it, that might involve making the spore more hardy so it survives in the environment longer, making the spore stay in the air or suspend in the air longer.
In this experiment, Army volunteers are exposed to an undisclosed aerosol germ.
It was possible to expose a person in each cubicle to a measured volume of biological aerosol from the sphere.
What happens next isn't revealed. But the narration claims there are no permanent effects.
Within a short time, they were up and around, completely recovered.
Without the knowledge of the public, testing is also carried out in urban areas. This U.S. Navy document reveals a secret 1950 open-air test in the heart of San Francisco Bay.
Certainly nobody in the civilian population knew that it had been undertaken.
2 strains of bacteria are secretly released into the wind from a naval destroyer.
When someone showed up in a hospital with an extremely rare case of exposure to a biological substance, doctors were perplexed.
The week after the experiment, 11 people are hospitalized with an infection never seen before. 1 dies. What might explain the outbreak remains unknown for 25 years, until documents like this come to light. It reveals the intimate involvement of scientist Frank Olson.
That was an experiment that Olson and Olson's colleagues were on site for.
Albarelli has spent 10 years investigating the work of Frank Olson, looking for clues that might explain his sudden death. Along the way, he's uncovered documents that link Olson to an even darker program, this time not for the Army, but for the CIA. Its codename, Project Artichoke.
It was extremely secret, above top secret.
Project Artichoke takes place in Germany in 1951. Its aim, the development of extreme interrogation techniques. Its subjects, German prisoners of war and Russian spies.
Their interrogations were extremely brutal.
CIA operatives use intimidation, isolation, even drugs. It's believed some interrogations ended in death.
Artichoke was an extremely serious project with terminal interrogations.
Olson was not an interrogator, but he was there. His role was to observe and record the effects of drugs on the subjects.
Frank was, in effect, collecting all information possible to go back and refine the use of the drugs.
Olson was deeply traumatized by what he saw.
There's one school of thought when he was in Germany that he had seen things that disturbed him. He thought that the experimentations that were being done with prisoners was unethical.
But is this disturbing experience enough to drive him to suicide? The search for answers takes Sirocco to where the mystery began. Room 1018A.
Being here now just raises the question as how he could have done it.
Former New York City cold case prosecutor Steve Sirocco worked the Frank Olson case for 2 years. He's considered the theory that Project Artichoke so disturbed Frank Olson, he was driven to suicide. Today, Sirocco's at the Hotel Statler, now the Pennsylvania, to see if the suicide theory stacks up. He heads for the room that Olson stayed in the night he died.
It's very eerie. This is the first time I've actually been in the room.
It's reported that Olson killed himself by plunging through this closed window to the sidewalk 10 floors below.
Being here now, looking at it live, just raises the question as how he could have done it.
Although some features of the room have been altered, the dimensions of the window and the position of the radiator are the same as they were in 1953. It's bizarre. Why would anyone commit suicide by diving through glass? Surely they'd open the window and jump out.
I mean, it's about 10 feet tall, maybe, about 6 feet wide. The radiator's here. He's gonna have to, yeah, that's quite a move to make that sort of Superman move to go through the window.
Sirocco can't help but wonder, could something else explain Olson's death? Could persons unknown in positions of authority have wanted him out of the picture?
There was motives to kill him. He knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the Cold War. Would they have killed an American citizen who's a scientist, who's working for the CIA and the Army, if they thought he was a security risk? There are people who say definitely.
If it was suicide, Sirocco wants to understand how it would have played out.
We would have to assume that he would have to get enough distance to generate enough velocity to propel himself through the window. So he's got it on his mind that he's going out that window. He's not going to open it, puts his back to the door, thinks his last thoughts, and takes the run for the window.
Olson had just 20 feet in which to accelerate towards the window. By some estimates, he would have needed to reach a speed of 30 miles per hour, faster than an Olympic sprinter. Then, vault 31 inches up over the radiator to the sill, duck to miss the horizontal window divider 70 inches off the floor, and crash through the window. A scenario that leaves Sirocco in doubt.
Dr. Olson was a big fellow. He was around 6'2", I believe, about 200 pounds. He was not a gymnast. This would require some sort of gymnastic ability to make this run and propel yourself over the radiator through the window. It just seems that it would require a degree of athletic ability that he just didn't possess. If this would have been a suicide, it would have been very difficult to accomplish.
Yet, the suicide story is backed by an eyewitness. When police rushed to room 1018A after Olson's fatal leap, they discovered that he wasn't alone.
The man identified himself as Robert Vern Lashbrook.
Lashbrook is a CIA scientist. He says he and Olson had been sharing the room.
And the police officer asked Lashbrook, well, what happened? Why did he go out the window? And Lashbrook said, I was sleeping, the lights were off in the room, and I woke up to the sound of breaking glass, turned on the light, and looked out the window and saw Olson lying on the sidewalk. The two police officers found Lashbrook's behavior highly suspicious. They immediately asked Lashbrook, well, if that's your friend on the sidewalk, why didn't you go down to check on him? And Lashbrook's response was, well, I assumed the police had been called, so I thought I'd just wait here. And that's, not a normal reply from somebody whose friend had just gone through a 10-story window.
Even more suspicious is a strange phone call overheard by the hotel operator.
One phone call had been made from the room at about the time that Olson had gone through the window.
Dr. Lashbrook saying to whoever's on the other end, well, he's gone, and the other end saying, well, that's too bad, I'm sorry.
The sudden death of Frank Olson comes as a shock to his wife and 3 children.
In 1953, the family was told that for whatever reason he became psychologically unstable, that they tried to help him by bringing him to New York. They were unable to help him, and he ultimately became suicidal and did in fact commit suicide.
Alice Olson knew her husband had been troubled by something about his work that he wouldn't discuss. But she's blindsided by the news he's killed himself.
Alice had no reason to suspect suicide. She was shocked. She knew he was upset, but she didn't think he was suicidal. And so she never really believed that Frank had committed suicide.
Despite the suspicious nature of the death, only a superficial autopsy is performed. The family is persuaded not to view Olson's corpse because the face is so badly disfigured by lacerations from the broken window.
After Frank died and was buried in Frederick, Maryland, the case basically dissipated. It just vanished. Nobody talked about it. Nobody raised any suspicions. Nobody at that point in time suspected foul play. And of course, at that point in time, nobody was really aware of the work that Frank Olson was doing.
But now, Albarelli does know, and it backs up some of the family's long-held suspicions. He thinks Olson's experimental work with one particular drug could be connected to his death.
A few days after Thanksgiving in 1953, Frank Olson, a scientist who worked for the CIA and for the military, fell to his death from a window of a hotel room in Manhattan in New York City.
Olson's death is reported as a suicide. But 2 decades later, a government inquiry into CIA activities leads to the release of previously secret documents. They link the CIA and Olson to a covert program of experiments in which patients were dosed with the drug lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD.
The last 3 years of Frank's life under contract with the CIA involved what Fort Detrick called psychoactive chemicals. And of course, at the top of the list with that was LSD.
LSD is a compound synthesized from a fungus called ergot, which grows naturally on grains such as rye. Its psychoactive properties are first discovered in 1943 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann.
He found that when working with this drug, he started experiencing some strange psychological symptoms. He described this strange dreamlike state, and he thought, this is curious.
LSD creates hallucinations because of its effect on the brain chemical serotonin.
This chemical modulates a range of different important functions, including the quality of our cognition or thinking, and also our emotion and our mood. It kind of hijacks the serotonin system. The whole of the brain becomes much more interconnected.
But that increased interconnection makes focusing on specific tasks difficult. In the early 1950s, the US Army becomes interested in LSD as a potential enemy disruptor. So they begin testing it on their own troops.
To observe the effects of the psychochemical on humans,
this previously classified footage shows one of those covert tests in action.
Prior to the test, the men behaved in a well-disciplined manner.
Before being dosed, the platoon's movements are well-drilled and precise.
During a break, each of the volunteers received a minute dose of the psychochemical in coffee.
After taking LSD, the parade descends into chaos.
They cannot control the impulse to laugh, and they no longer behave like well-disciplined troops.
The initial interest in LSD was by the science director. He saw LSD as a weapon that wouldn't result in fatalities or deaths and could be used in spray form and just debilitate the opposing forces.
They have become confused, irrational, and uncontrollable.
The CIA see another potential use for LSD as an interrogation tool.
They had a high interest in developing a truth serum as a means of interrogating Nazi and Japanese POWs.
Under the influence of LSD, someone who's being interrogated may be more inclined to let slip information that would be valuable to the interrogator.
In 1953, that research spins off into a notorious CIA project called MK-Ultra. Its aim, mind control. Its subjects, unwitting American civilians, hospital patients, and prisoners.
MK-Ultra is hugely ethically questionable what was going on, because often the drugs are given without any prior warning at all.
MK-Ultra is run by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. His key collaborator is Robert Lashbrook, the CIA scientist in Olson's room on the night he died. Based on this information, Albarelli begins to suspect a connection between the LSD experiments and Olson's death. He discovers a deadly incident linked to Olson 3,500 miles away in a tiny French town where hundreds of people suffer wild hallucinations.
There was a mass hysteria.
Between 35 and 50 people were carted off to nearby insane asylums. 5 to 6 people died that day.
In the early 1950s, Frank Olson travels to Europe on top-secret scientific missions for the US Army and CIA. In November 1953, he's found dead on the sidewalk outside a Manhattan hotel. Investigative reporter Hank Albarelli believes Olson's work in Europe and his death may be connected. The link, an outbreak of mass mania in a remote French village called Pont Saint-Esprit.
At Pont Saint-Esprit, there was a number of instances of very outlandish behavior.
There was a mass hysteria. People behaving in a psychotic way.
On the morning of August 15th, without explanation, suddenly, hundreds of villagers go violently insane.
A little boy attacked and tried to murder his mother. Another man thought his stomach was full of snakes and was tearing at his flesh. Between 35 and 50 people were carted off to nearby insane asylums in Marseille. 5 to 6 people died that day, most likely by killing themselves.
At the time, the only explanation: contaminated bread.
There's a theory that perhaps this was related to a mass ergot poisoning.
Ergot is a fungus that infects rye. If consumed, it causes chemical changes in the brain that can induce mania. But in this classified U.S. intelligence document, a source claims that tests of the bread revealed no ergot. Instead, the source says the contaminant was a chemical compound. Although almost illegible, the type is believed to refer to D-lysergic diethylamide or diethylysergamide, both chemical terms for LSD. The explosive allegation, Pont Saint-Esprit, was a secret LSD experiment undertaken by the U.S. Army and/or CIA.
Throughout the 1950s, the CIA were interested in the mass exposure of chemical and biological agents to communities to see how it could affect them.
A secret 1954 memorandum released by the Freedom of Information Act in 2004 shows mass LSD dosings were on the CIA's radar. Albarelli believes they tested the concept 3 years earlier at Pont Saint-Esprit.
I've spoken to a number of experts that liquid LSD was just basically poured onto the bread. The intent of the experiment was to firsthand measure what would happen if an entire small village or city was targeted with ingestion of LSD. The U.S. government has never admitted any involvement whatsoever.
Frank Olson's passport shows he made multiple trips to France in the early 1950s. And Albarelli can specifically link him to the Pont Saint-Esprit incident.
This is an extremely important document. It's on White House stationery, and it lists virtually everybody that was involved in the Pont Saint-Esprit case.
2 documents on White House stationery suggest Olson had intimate knowledge of a potentially devastating secret.
The U.S. government wouldn't want knowledge of their participation in Pont Saint-Esprit primarily because of diplomatic reasons, and it would also open the government up to lawsuits on behalf of survivors in Pont Saint-Esprit.
Could the deadly secret of Pont Saint-Esprit somehow be linked to Olson's death? For 40 years, some Olson family members suspect they haven't been told the whole truth. Then, in 1994, they win a major legal victory. The right to exhume Dr. Olson's body from the grave. Will an autopsy finally reveal the truth? When Army scientist Frank Olson falls 10 stories to his death on November 28, 1953, he's not alone. Sharing his Manhattan hotel room is CIA scientist Robert Lashbrook. He tells police Olson crashed through the closed window. But others believe there's more to the story.
The story is that Frank was murdered, and murdered by the CIA to conceal a very deadly secret that they had been keeping all these years.
There are many things that we still don't know about the events surrounding my father's death, many because...
For 40 years, Olson's family refused to believe he committed suicide. They believe he was troubled by the scientific work he was being ordered to do for the Army and CIA and was about to go public.
But I was convinced that my husband's death was not a deliberate or a willful act.
They lobby for the release of all papers related to his death. But suspicion remains of a cover-up amongst the highest levels of government.
You have the whole weight of the U.S. government and the secret government agency and the CIA trying to keep it a secret.
By 1994, there's just one last hope. The Olson family applies to the state of Maryland to exhume Dr. Olson's body and wins.
The body comes out of the grave in 1994.
Frank Olson was embalmed prior to burial, which delays decomposition. Immediately, examiners notice something that doesn't stack up.
The Olson family had been told in 1953 that the body was so lacerated it wasn't appropriate for viewing, and that just wasn't true.
Authorities had said that Olson's face was grotesquely disfigured by wounds caused by his headlong dive through the glass. The 1994 autopsy shows otherwise.
Frank Olson had no scratches on his face that he would have had he crashed through a window.
Forensic examiner Catherine Maloney has reviewed the Olson autopsy. She finds the lack of lacerations unusual at best.
I would expect that a dive through a plate glass window would produce numerous sharp force injuries on a person's body.
The fact that there were no lacerations or injuries consistent with smashing through a window like that kind of indicates to me that maybe that window wasn't smashed by him and maybe the window was broken beforehand.
Could someone have smashed the window, then thrown Olson's body out? The autopsy suggests that's a possibility.
Frank Olson sustained a subgaleal hematoma right here above the left eye. A hematoma is basically a fancy name for a bruise. One of the theories is that Frank Olson committed suicide, and in the process of committing suicide, jumped through a closed plate glass window, striking his head here as he jumped through the window. While possible, it seems more likely to me that he would end up with a more severe injury in this area, such as a skull fracture or perhaps a laceration or a break in the skin.
A more plausible explanation for the hematoma: a blow to the head with a blunt instrument.
A hematoma would be a fairly common injury for someone struck with an object.
Members of the 1994 forensic team believe Olson's hematoma pointed to possible foul play.
They concluded that there was a hematoma which was not consistent with the fall, but rather consistent with being struck by a blunt instrument and at that point thrown from the window.
Suddenly, forensic science suggests not suicide, but murder of a man who knows America's darkest secrets. Germ tests in San Francisco Bay, brutal interrogations in Germany, an alleged deadly LSD experiment in France. If Olson had threatened to expose those secrets, what steps might the CIA take to silence him?
It's quite possible that he could be subject to a murder so that he would not be able to pass that information on.
Those who believe the murder theory say the groundwork to silence Olson starts a week before he dies, when the scientist suddenly becomes part of the experiment.
That's a document that clearly establishes that Frank Olson was dosed with LSD.
In 1953, Frank Olson is deeply conflicted about secret scientific experiments he's been conducting for the Army and CIA, codenamed Project Artichoke.
Olson was really making an effort to break away. Olson was very vocal to a number of his friends and neighbors that he wanted to get away.
For those in charge of the covert bioweapons projects, Olson is becoming a major threat. On November 18th, he's summoned to a retreat at Deep Creek Lake in Maryland by Stanley Gottlieb, head of MKUltra, and CIA scientist Robert Lashbrook.
There was an effort made on the part of Gottlieb and Lashbrook to really get at the root of what was going on with Frank Olson. Why was he talking so often out of school?
At first, the meeting is friendly. But has Olson walked into a trap?
Dr. Olson knew that he was not feeling himself and was feeling rather bizarre.
That's a document that leaves one with no doubt that Olson was given LSD at Deep Creek Lake.
The scientist gets a taste of his own medicine. As the LSD takes effect, the interrogation begins. But it's believed Olson may have hit back with an ultimatum.
If Fort Detrick didn't agree to let him resign, he was going to start talking about some very sensitive things. One of those things being Ponce Esprit.
It's a dangerous card to play. Suddenly, the game's changed.
It was obvious something quite serious had to be done to keep him silent.
Now, the stakes are potentially lethal.
I think Ponce Esprit was more than a big enough secret to kill someone over.
Soon after the rendezvous at Deep Creek Lake, Lashbrook escorts Olson to a Manhattan psychiatrist who recommends he be committed to the psychiatric hospital, Chestnut Lodge. For the CIA, it could be a perfect and permanent solution.
It's my opinion that had Olson gone into Chestnut Lodge, that he would have never come out.
The evening prior to admission, Olson is staying at the Hotel Statler. Lashbrook joins him in room 1018A to keep watch through the night. But Frank Olson won't live to see daylight. So what happened in the lead up to Olson's death at 2:30 a.m.? Did Lashbrook change the plan and decide to silence Olson himself? Steve Sirocco has his doubts.
If you got a 6-foot guy who's fighting for his life, I think you'd have to dismiss Lashbrook as being the assassin. He was a scientist. He wasn't in the muscle end of the business. Lashbrook would have had to let somebody in, maybe 2 people in, who were in that end of the business.
According to Albarelli's research and interviews with anonymous CIA sources, that's exactly how it went down.
I spent a number of years investigating what really happened in that room in 1018A that night, and was able to come to the conclusion that Frank had been thrown from the window by 2 very unsavory characters who happened to be in the employ for the CIA at that time. These 2 names, it's Pierre Lafitte, Francois Spirito.
Francois Spirito and Pierre Lafitte are criminal underworld figures who had become CIA assets.
And they were in the room with Frank Olson in November of 1953.
After a decade of investigation, Albarelli believes he finally knows what happened that night. Spirito and Lafitte enter Olson's room with orders to escort him to Chestnut Lodge as planned. But the mission goes wrong. Olson resists. There's a struggle. And Dr. Frank Olson is pitched out of the window.
The evidence that it was Lafitte and Spirito that ushered Olson out the window is pretty overwhelming. It came from extremely good CIA sources. What I was told was that there was a level of frustration that was reached in terms of Olson resisting, and it was just like a what the hell moment thrown through the window.
Decades-old doubts about Frank Olson's suicide finally seem laid to rest. It appears he never made that lethal sprint. But was this really a mission gone wrong, as Albarelli believes? Or was it premeditated assassination? Evidence from the 1994 autopsy and sensational documents later released under the Freedom of Information Act point to what Olson's family members long suspected: foul play. This 1953 CIA report is an instruction manual for murder. It reads like a sinister script for the fatal drama that played out in the Hotel Statler.
The most efficient assassination is a fall of 75 feet or more. Care is required to ensure that no wound or condition not attributable to the fall is discernible after death.
Is Olson's death a textbook case of an assassination staged to look like a suicide, with Dr. Lashbrook left behind to bear false witness?
If the assassin immediately sets up an outcry, playing the horrified witness, no alibi or surreptitious withdrawal is necessary.
I mean, this is right on the money. Isn't that what we have here?
The Assassination Manual, the devastating secret of Pont Saint-Esprit, the lack of facial lacerations, the hematoma. The weight of evidence suggests Olson's death may not have been a suicide or an accident, but premeditated murder.
I think someone broke that window and then threw him out the window.
But with so many years passing since that fatal night, the full truth of what happened may never be known.
I think it's impossible to solve the case now because nobody exists any longer at the CIA that's even familiar with the case. I think what's a mystery now concerning the case will stay a mystery forever.
Yet, the suspicion lingers that Frank Olson died because he simply knew too much.